Story 1. The Plague of Athens, 430 BCE. The outbreak began inside the walls. In 430 BCE, Athens was at the height of its power, an imperial democracy, fortified, wealthy, and at war with Sparta. To avoid invasion, Pericles ordered the rural population of Attica to shelter inside the city. Tens of thousands crowded into a space never designed for them. Wells were shared. Waste accumulated. Then the sickness appeared. No warning. No known cure. No precedent. According to the historian Thucydides, an eyewitness who survived, the disease arrived to the port of Piraeus, Athens' trade lifeline. Victims developed sudden fever, burning eyes, bleeding throats, uncontrollable diarrhea, and dehydration, so severe they threw themselves into water. Many died within days. Others lingered, blinded or maimed, bodies stacked in temples. Funeral rites collapsed. Law broke down. The data is fragmentary, but the scale is not. Modern estimates suggest 25 to 30% of Athens' population died, including soldiers, sailors, and civic officials. The timing was catastrophic. This was year 2 of the Peloponnesian War. Then the generals fell. Then the crews vanished. Even Pericles, the architect of Athenian power, did not escape. After losing his sons to the disease, he himself died in 429 BCE. With him went strategic restraint. Athens cycled through unstable leadership, rash decisions, and internal purges. Military campaigns failed. Allies defected. The democracy radicalized under pressure it could no longer manage. The response was not medical. It was rhetorical. Athenians blamed poison wells, foreign enemies, or divine punishment. Oracles were reinterpreted after the fact. No quarantine system emerged. No lasting public health reform followed. Thucydides notes something else. Physicians died first, exposed repeatedly, leaving fewer records and less resistance. Medical knowledge vanished with them. The healers went silent. The consequences were irreversible. Athens survived the war on paper, but its imperial dominance never recovered. Within a generation, it was no longer the axis of the Greek world. Sparta won. Then Macedonia rose. Then Athens became a symbol, not a power. And one humane loss cuts through the numbers. Parent abandoned sick children in the streets, because staying meant death. Later historians emphasized strategy, hubris, and military overreach. The plague was treated as background noise, an unfortunate episode during a real conflict. But without the disease, the war's outcome looks different. Without the mass death, the political collapse never accelerates. Disease didn't accompany Athens' fall. It destabilized at first. Within 50 years, another empire would repeat the mistake on a larger scale. Story 2. The Antonine Plague, 165 to 180 CE. It returned with the army. In 165 CE, Roman legions marched back from campaigns in Mesopotamia, victorious and infected. The empire spanned 3 continents, bound by roads, ports, and constant movement. That infrastructure, Rome's greatest strength, became the delivery system. The cost began first, then the fever, then the scars. The physician Galen, present in Rome and later at military camps, described the disease in clinical fragments: high fever, diarrhea, inflamed throats, and a skin eruption that scabbed over before death or survival. Modern analysis points to smallpox. The pattern fits. So does the immunity curve that followed. What the numbers suggest is staggering. Conservative estimates place the death toll between 5 and 10 million people. In some cities, mortality reached 10% or higher. At its peak, Rome itself reportedly lost 2,000 people per day. Recruitment failed. Farms went untilled. Tax collection collapsed in entire provinces. The legions thinned. The borders softened. The imperial response was administrative silence. There was no empire-wide health mobilization. No standardized reporting. Instead, Emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus ordered emergency conscriptions and increased religious rites. Public sacrifices multiplied. Temples filled as infirmaries emptied. And then something else happened. Galen left Rome. Not once, but twice, each time as outbreaks intensified. His surviving writings are extensive, but scholars have long noted missing volumes from this period. Entire medical treatises referenced by later authors no longer exist. Whether lost, suppressed, or never copied, the result is the same. The most documented physician of antiquity goes partially silent during history's deadliest outbreak to that point. The notes stop. The record thins. The consequences were structural. Economic output dropped. Slave prices rose, signaling labor shortages. Military units were understrength for decades. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, he left an empire already weakened in ways chroniclers struggle to explain without invoking moral decline. One humane loss pierces the abstraction. Families burn the bodies of multiple children in a single ceremony because burial space ran out. Later historians framed the period as the beginning of Rome's slow decay. The plague was mentioned, then minimized. But when mortality removes millions from an interconnected system, decay is not philosophical. It is mathematical. And Rome would face the same test again, soon. A century later, daily deaths would be counted in the thousands. Story 3. The Cyprian Plague, 250 to 270 CE. It struck an empire already exhausted. By the mid-3rd century, Rome was fractured by civil war, border pressure, and inflation. Then, around 250 CE, a new epidemic surfaced, first in Africa, then across the Mediterranean world. The Bishop Cyprian of Carthage described it not as an illness, but as a wave. Eyes burned. Limbs failed. The voice disappeared. Victims suffered relentless diarrhea, vomiting, fever, throat lesions, and bleeding extremities. Hearing and vision were lost before death. Cyprian's account is vivid and unavoidably biological. Whatever the pathogen, possibly a viral hemorrhagic fever, the disease moved fast and killed indiscriminately. The scale overwhelmed the state. In Rome, later chroniclers claimed up to 5,000 deaths per day at the peak. Entire households vanished. The army, already stretched thin, could not replace its losses. Recruitment orders went unanswered. Border defenses weakened without a single battle being fought. The rolls emptied. The forts waited. The imperial response was coercive, not curative. Authorities issued mass cremation orders to prevent panic and speed disposal. Bodies were burned without identification. Census-taking stopped in multiple provinces. Coinage was debased again, accelerating economic collapse. And as fear spread, blame followed. Pagans accused Christians of angering the gods. Christians saw the plague as a test or a sign. Medical voices faded. There are no surviving physician treatises dedicated to the outbreak. No coordinated response. Just sermons, edicts, and ash. The doctors vanish. The fire stays lit. The consequences hardened into permanence. Emperors died of disease. Succession became chaotic. Regions depopulated. The empire entered what historians later called the crisis of the 3rd century, as if the crisis were political, not biological. One humane law survives in a single line from Cyprian's circle. Parents carry their own children to the pyres, because no one else would. Later historians folded the plague into a list of instabilities. But the timeline disagrees. The epidemic does not follow collapse. It precedes and accelerates it. And this time, the record doesn't just thin. It is intentionally erased. 3 centuries later, the same bacterium would return with a name. Story 4. The Plague of Justinian, 541 to 549 CE. It began at the grain docks. In 541 CE, ships arriving from Egypt unloaded wheat at the port of Pelusium and something else. Within weeks, disease spread along the Mediterranean trade network, reaching Constantinople, the largest city in the world. This was not rumor or allegory. It was recorded in real time. The swellings appeared. Then the delirium. Then the silence. The historian Procopius described victims with sudden fever and painful buboes in the groin and armpits. Many lapsed into coma. Others died screaming. Modern analysis confirms what the symptoms imply. Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague. DNA recovered from 6th century graves removes doubt. This was the first recorded plague pandemic. At its peak, Constantinople reportedly lost 10,000 people per day. Corpses filled homes. Streets were blocked. The Emperor Justinian ordered bodies stacked in towers outside the city walls when burial space failed. Work stopped. Trade froze. The capital of the Eastern Roman Empire ceased to function. The mills went quiet. The tax ledgers closed. The response was improvisational and political. Justinian continued issuing laws as the city died around him. No border closures. No coordinated quarantine. Officials fled. Survivors looted abandoned houses. Procopius notes that entire professions disappeared in a single season. The consequences reshaped history. Justinian's campaign to reconquer the Western Roman territories collapsed under the strain. Italy depopulated. Revenues evaporated. The empire survived, but permanently reduced militarily, economically, demographically. One humane loss cuts through the imperial scale. Gravediggers died so quickly that strangers were forced to bury entire neighborhoods. The plague did not end in 549. It returned in waves for 2 centuries. Each resurgence stripped more resilience from the state. When later enemies arrived, they did not face Rome at full strength. They faced a system already hollowed out by repeated infection. Yet medieval chroniclers framed the era as one of overreach or divine judgment. Disease became background. But the record is clear. This time, the collapse left bones and bacteria to testify. In the East, record survived. In the East again, they would soon disappear. Story 5. The Fall of the Han Dynasty, 2nd to 3rd century CE. The population vanished first. At its height, the Han Dynasty governed more than 60 million people. supported by one of the most advanced bureaucratic systems in the ancient world. Census taking was meticulous. Grain storage was regulated. Medical texts circulated among court physicians. Then, in the late 2nd century CE, the numbers collapse. The registers thin. The villages empty. The couriers stop arriving. Between 156 CE and 280 CE, official population figures drop by more than 50%. Some of that loss reflects war and displacement, but the speed is the anomaly. Entire commanderies report sudden depopulation without corresponding battle records. Local gazetteers describe waves of warm illness, fever outbreaks, and sudden death that move faster than armies ever could. Chinese medical texts from the period reference mass epidemics, conditions later grouped under Weni, pestilential diseases. Symptoms included high fever, delirium, respiratory distress, and rapid mortality. Physicians recorded that whole households fell ill at once. Graves multiplied. Fields went untilled. The harvest failed. Then the healers failed. The state response was fragmented. Court factions blamed corruption, peasant unrest, or celestial imbalance. Rituals replaced remedies. Meanwhile, the Yellow Turban Rebellion erupted, not just from ideology, but from desperation. Its leaders promised healing and survival in a world where the imperial system no longer protected bodies. As instability spread, so did disease. Armies on the move carried infection between provinces. Refugees crowded into cities. The Han court lost control of taxation, then recruitment, then territory. By 220 CE, the dynasty formally ended, fractured into rival kingdoms. One humane loss appears in a provincial account. A magistrate records sealing his office after burying his entire household. Later historians emphasize rebellion and war as primary causes. One could argue that political corruption alone explains the Han collapse, but the mortality curves appear before the wars fully ignite. The order matters. What makes this collapse distinct is what disappears next. China possessed an advanced medical tradition, yet no comprehensive epidemic chronicle survives from a Han court. Treatises referenced by later physicians are missing. Administrative silence replaces clinical detail. The bureaucracy that once counted every household stops counting people altogether. The ink runs out. The math is avoided. The consequences lasted centuries. Population recovery was slow. Technological progress stalled. Regional warlords replaced centralized authority. The idea of a unified empire survived, but the system that sustained it did not. The Han did not fall in a single moment. It hemorrhaged population until governance became theoretical. And once again, disease was written out of the final explanation. Within 400 years, another empire would collapse in less than one. Story 6. The Sassanian Collapse, 627 to 651 CE. The king died coughing. In the early 7th century, the Sassanian Persian Empire stretched from Mesopotamia to Central Asia. It was Rome's eastern rival, centralized, wealthy, and militarized. But after decades of war with Byzantium, the system was exhausted. Then disease returned. The fever spread. The court emptied. The crown passed too fast. Chroniclers record repeated outbreaks of plague in Mesopotamia and western Iran during the 620s and 630s. Part of the same epidemiological cycle unleashed by the plague of Justinian. Cities along the Tigris and Euphrates, trade hubs and troop corridors, were hit hardest. Mortality weakened garrisons already stretched by years of campaigning. The most consequential death came in 628 CE. King Khosrow II was overthrown and executed after military collapse. His successor, Kavit II, ruled for only months before dying, likely a plague. What followed was unprecedented. Over a decade, more than 10 rulers rose and fell, some reigning mere weeks. Several are recorded as dying of illness. The line breaks. The order's conflict. The state's response was paralysis. Tax collection failed as administrators died or fled. Fields were abandoned. Supply chains snapped. When armies could be raised, they were understrengthened and poorly provisioned. The empire still existed on parchment, but not on the ground. One humane law survives in a later Persian account. A village elder describes locking the gates after burying half his people, knowing no help would come. When Arab forces began their campaigns in the 630s, they did not confront a cohesive superpower. They faced provinces already depopulated, armies thinned by disease, and a political system shattered by succession crises driven by mortality. The battles were brief. The collapse was not. Within a single generation, the Sassanian Empire ceased to exist. Histories often attribute the fall to military defeat alone. But armies do not disintegrate that quickly without internal failure. The timing matters. The plague resurged first. The crown followed. Disease did not defeat Persia in battle. It removed the empire's ability to resist. Next, a city of 100,000 would vanish without an enemy. Story 7, Teotihuacan's silent death, c. 50 C. There were no siege marks. For centuries, Teotihuacan dominated central Mexico. At its height, the city housed over 100,000 people, with planned avenues, massive pyramids, and a reach that shaped Mesoamerica. Then, around 550 CE, it failed. No invasion layer, no mass battlefield graves, no conqueror's monument. Archaeology shows something stranger. Elite compounds were burned from the inside. Administrative buildings were abandoned. Entire neighborhoods emptied in a narrow window of time. The city did not fall violently from without. It unraveled. Evidence points to systemic stress, prolonged drought, food shortages, and social unrest. But drought alone does not empty a metropolis at once. What does is disease moving through a dense, immunologically vulnerable population already weakened by hunger. The sickness leaves no bones. But the silence remains. Skeletal remains from the period show signs of nutritional stress and abrupt mortality patterns. Burials increase, then stop. Trade goods vanish from later layers. Craft production collapses. Long-distance exchange networks, Teotihuacan's lifeblood, cease almost simultaneously. There are no written medical records. Teotihuacan left no texts, but absence itself is data. When cities are conquered, records change hands. When they are abandoned, records end. The response appears internal and desperate. The burning of elite compounds suggests revolt, but revolt requires bodies. It requires people healthy enough to organize. Disease explains both popular anger and sudden depopulation. One humane loss emerges from a single excavated dwelling, a household meal left unfinished, sealed beneath collapse, never returned to. Within decades, Teotihuacan was a ruin. Later cultures treated it as sacred, not political. They inherited monuments without institutions, memory without explanation. Historians long debated why such a powerful city could disappear so completely. Warfare never fit the evidence. Climate alone was insufficient. A pandemic does not need armies. It only needs density. And once it passes, it leaves no victor, only emptiness. Far south, another civilization would empty its cities the same way. Story 8. The Maya terminal collapse, 800 to 900 CE. The inscriptions stop mid-reign. For centuries, classic Maya cities tracked time with obsessive precision. Steely recorded births, accessions, wars, down to the day. Then, across the southern lowlands, the dates end, not gradually, abruptly. The calendar halts. The courts empty. The gods receive no names. Between 800 and 900 CE, dozens of major Maya cities were abandoned. Palaces were left standing. Reservoirs silted up. Elite tombs ceased. This was not a single event, but a synchronized failure across hundreds of kilometers. Drought is part of the explanation. Paleoclimate data confirms prolonged dry periods. But drought alone does not erase administration. What follows drought is migration. What follows migration is crowding. And crowding breeds disease. The bodies leave no text. Bioarchaeological evidence shows increased childhood mortality, nutritional stress, and abrupt population decline. Burial practices change, then disappear. In some sites, mass graves appear without markers. Trade networks collapse, cutting off obsidian, jade, and salt, materials essential not just for wealth, but for survival. What makes the Maya collapse distinct is the administrative silence. Like Rome after Galen, like Han China after its census drop, medical or state explanations do not survive. There is no Maya word recorded for the catastrophe. Only abandonment. The scribes stop carving. The political system fails first at the top. Kings disappear from the record. Dynastic lines end without heirs. Rituals that legitimize rule cease. Without central authority, coordinated responses to drought or disease become impossible. Cities hollow out from the center, then the periphery. One humane loss is carved into absence. Children born after 850 CE are never named in stone. This is the climax of the pattern. Dense cities. Climate stress. Migration. Epidemic. Administrative collapse. Cultural memory loss. The Maya were not conquered. They were emptied. And the pattern is no longer regional. It is global. To the north, the same pathogen was already waiting. Story 9. The Black Death before the Black Death, Central Asia, 13th century. The trail goes cold before Europe ever notices. By the early 1200s, Central Asia was the spine of the world economy. Caravan cities connected China, the Islamic world, and Europe. Goods move fast. So did disease. Long before the Black Death devastated Europe, something began killing populations along the Silk Road itself. The caravans shrink. The towns thin. The records fracture. Archaeological evidence from lake burials near Issyk-Kul, dated to 1338 to 1339, shows sudden mass death marked explicitly as pestilence. Ancient DNA extracted from these graves confirms early lineages of Yersinia pestis, ancestral to the strain that would later reach Europe. This was not the aftershock. It was the ignition point. Trade hubs began failing in sequence. Way stations emptied. Tax records from Mongol administrators decline sharply, then stop. Chroniclers mention bad air and sudden death, but provide no sustained medical analysis. The same pattern appears again. The explanation fades. The movement continues. As merchants fled, refugees carried infection outward. Crimea, the Black Sea, Mediterranean ports. By the time the disease reached Europe in the 1340s, it was already refined by years of transmission through dense, mobile populations. Here is where the breadcrumb closes. Like Rome under Galen, the Central Asian outbreaks produce administrative silence. We know these regions maintain records, customs logs, caravan taxes, diplomatic correspondence. Yet for the critical years, documentation collapses. Historians later reconstruct the story backward from European devastation, treating Central Asia as a corridor, not a casualty. Just like Galen's volumes, the records stopped mid-sentence. The consequences were not abstract. Entire trade routes shifted south. Cities that had existed for centuries never recovered. Power consolidated elsewhere. The Mongol Empire, often blamed for spreading the plague, was itself destabilized by mortality among troops, horses, and administrators. One humane law survives in a single grave cluster, entire families buried together, with no goods, no rights, no names. The cadence accelerates here because the system fails faster. Disease outruns governance. There is no state strong enough to suppress the narrative, only gaps left behind. By the time Europe begins counting its dead, the first civilizations have already vanished without a ledger. Their role is minimized because their archives are gone. This is a true prelude to the Black Death, not a mystery, a warning ignored. And it proves the pattern decisively. Pandemics do not announce themselves at the center. They erase the edges first. Across the ocean, a great city would disappear before anyone arrived. Story 10. Cahokia's Vanishing, 14th century. It was already dying before contact. Near the Mississippi River, Cahokia rose as the largest city north of Mesoamerica. At its peak, between 1050 and 1200 CE, it supported tens of thousands of people, organized around massive earthen mounds, trade networks stretching across the continent, and a complex social hierarchy. Then, in the early 1300s, it emptied. No invasion, no foreign weapons, no replacement city. Archaeology shows population decline beginning decades before European arrival. Houses were abandoned. Public works ceased. Fields reverted to forest. The political center dissolved without conquest. The environmental stress is clear. Flooding increased. Deforestation worsened disease vectors. Urban density intensified exposure. What follows such conditions in every other case we've examined is epidemic disease, especially in populations with no previous immunity to emerging pathogens. The sick leave no chronicle. Burial patterns change abruptly. Grave goods disappear. Some bodies show signs of nutritional stress and rapid death. There is no evidence of mass warfare. No burned city layer. Instead, there is retreat. The response appears fragmented. Smaller satellite villages persist briefly, then fade. Trade in copper, shells, and stone tools collapses. Social authority evaporates. Cahokia does not fall, it depopulates. One humane law survives in a single abandoned structure, a child's footprint preserved in mud, with no adult prints returning beside it. Later narratives frame Cahokia's disappearance as cultural failure or environmental mismanagement. But those explanations avoid the central anomaly: speed. Large urban systems do not empty themselves cleanly without a force that moves faster than politics. Here is a final reveal. Cahokia's silence mirrors Athens, Rome, the Han, the Maya, and Central Asia. Dense population, environmental stress, trade connectivity, then disease, and after disease, no one left to record it. This is a hinge. Pandemics don't just kill civilizations. They erase the evidence that they ever did. And once the record is gone, history fills a gap with safer stories. What else have we misdiagnosed? Because the dead couldn't testify.